There was a time where Oregon's matchup with Washington State was one that you glossed over as an easy win and were looking to see who you played next, but those days are long gone. For their September 24th matchup up in Pullman, is Oregon ripe to get caught in a trap game in their season opener? It's possible, but I think the answer might be no. I'll tell you why today on the show. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why you should like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who has done so already. A reminder for those of you who might just be tuning in, for the shows that are running this week and next week, I've taped them well ahead of time because I'm on vacation in a place that doesn't have a super reliable or consistent internet, so didn't want to risk having to do shows and take time out of a break with my family up there. But if you want to get a question answered by me, at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks are the Twitter handles. You can hop in the YouTube comments too, and I'll just respond to you right then and there. And maybe if a big piece of news breaks, I'll be able to get a podcast out there. But still ways to stay in touch with me, be involved with the show. Keep hopping in the YouTube comments. I love seeing the debate. Keep it civil, keep it respectful, everybody. But for the most part, it is, and I love seeing people go back and forth and engage here on the channel. When I was growing up and becoming an Oregon football fan, I always was, but becoming a bigger one, right? A more engaged one. When I was young, Washington State was just not a game you ever had to worry about. It was a game where, I'd turn it on, but by halftime, I was texting my friends, hey, want to get together? Want to go hang out? Because the Ducks got this one in the bag. We all know that those days have since passed, and Washington State is now a team that very much has to be dealt with and accounted for and taken seriously, especially when you play them up in the Palouse, which is what Oregon is going to have to do this year for their conference opener on September 24th. Now, we talked with Jake Hatch of Locked On Cougars yesterday and talked about that game with BYU, which I think will be a close Oregon win. I think this could be a close Oregon win as well. But there's something about the way last year's game played out that gives me more confidence than I think I would otherwise have, because you're coming off what is going to be a tough game against BYU, and you have to go on the road for your first Pac-12 game. I mean, those are not a good set of circumstances to have, and makes you seem ripe for being susceptible to a trap game. But I actually don't think that's the case here for Oregon, and I'll tell you why. A year ago, the game in Eugene, which was a 38-24 final in favor of the Ducks, was pretty competitive throughout. Oregon jumped out to a 14-0 lead. Then Travis Dye fumbled, gave the ball to the Cougars. They got back in it. It was 14-14 at the half. Now, Oregon would have been down 7-0 in that game if Jaden DeLora hadn't fumbled at the goal line, so there was a turnover going both ways. But Anthony Brown later in the game was pushing hard to get into the end zone, and he was stripped at the goal line, probably got in, but it wasn't conclusive, yada, yada, yada. Oregon lost another chance to score. But the Travis Dye fumble, yeah, that's going to happen. The Anthony Brown one, little bit flukier there. And the reason I say that the way the game played out gives me more confidence is I think Oregon was better than Washington State last year, and they won the game, and it showed that out. But I think they were even better than that team. Now, the Cougars this year should be a little better than last year. Offensively, they have a new quarterback by the name of Cam Ward, who comes up from the FCS level at Incarnate Ward in Texas in the Southland Conference, and his former head coach, now offensive coordinator, Eric Morris, is with them up there in Pullman. And there's some pretty high hopes there. And Ward was a highly sought-after transfer. He rated on 24/7 in the portal as a more coveted transfer quarterback prospect than either Keaton Slovis or Spencer Rattler, who went to Pitt and South Carolina. At Washington State was able to get this guy because they hired his head coach, probably. But He figures to be a guy who can throw for a lot of yards, even more so than Jaden Delora, who I liked a lot. But Cam Ward in 2021, I know it's at the FCS level, but we've seen what Vernon Adams was capable of. Cam Ward went for 47 touchdowns and 10 picks in 2021. So the guy knows how to sling it around the field. The question will be whether or not he can make that adjustment to the next level. So in that sense, Washington State figures to be better. But I think a hallmark, for better or worse, there was some worse and some better, of the Mario Cristobal era was that style of game against Washington State. Jump out to an early lead, show that you're the better team, look like you're going to control it and dominate the game, and then let them back into it, have it be a close game for most of 4 quarters, maybe pull away a little bit at the end for a 10-plus point win, but ultimately it felt like a grind that you had to watch, every second of, and you're kind of holding your breath, hoping there isn't a big mistake that's going to let the other team back into it. I think this Washington State game was really a microcosm of that, or just a one game example of something that we saw pretty often. And what I'm hopeful about this year and going forward is that Dan Lanning and this new staff will be able to get back to beating opponents that you're better than by more than just 7 to 10 points, or just 14 points, and having them, kind of hang around. And by the end of the fourth quarter, it wasn't stressful. Oregon had a 3-score lead at one point, I'm pretty sure. And then Washington State had a late touchdown, and 38-24 was the final margin. But I think that was a game last year where, if you were looking at it in the Chip Kelly era, even with those teams, right, not the Chip teams versus the Cougar teams that he was playing back then, but that matchup, if you had, I think, better game planning and better coaching, or a different coaching maybe in place, you could have won that game 42-14 instead of 38-24, because it looked like Oregon was going to run away with it. Sloppy turnover. Offense stalled in that second quarter as Washington State made some defensive adjustments, and Jake Dickert, pretty solid defensive coach from what we can tell at this point in time. So in that sense, I feel like Oregon is even more better than Washington State than we think going into this game. Though I do like the Cougars, and this is not a game that I think Oregon should be able to take lightly. But I do think that the Ducks have the better roster here, which is not a particularly hot take. The question is whether or not they're going to be able to do things they weren't capable of a season ago. Another change that I hope Oregon's able to make in this game from last year, that early potential touchdown that Jaden Delora fumbled through the end zone. They got down there with a big play on offense, and I think Oregon allowed too many receivers to run open a season ago at times, and there were just too many big plays like that the defense allowed throughout the course of the year, and the statistics back that up. Oregon was not near I think they were near the bottom of the conference actually in yards allowed per game. They'd stiffen in the red zone a little, but I'm not a huge fan of the bend but don't break when you allow that many yards and as many points as Oregon did a season ago. So if the defense can improve in that sense, then I think Oregon will be just fine in this game. I'll tell you what it looks like if Oregon wins and how the game plays out after I tell you about BetOnline, the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, Go Mariners, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even my personal favorite, golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. If Oregon's going to go up to Pullman and get the win, I'm not going to be worried if they get down early, right? If they're staring at maybe an early 10-0 deficit or something like they did at USC in 2019, or if Washington State scores first, I won't be super panicked. But I really think this game is going to play out in a way that we're hoping as Duck fans. And I think that the way it plays out if Oregon wins is they come out swinging in a sense, really on both sides of the ball, and they stay aggressive, and they don't sit back in soft zone and give them underneath stuff and whatnot. I think you have to go toe to toe in one-on-one matchups, and say, hey, we think our guys can beat your guys. And if you do that, I think that's how you can pull away big in this game. Now, the secondary is a question mark in that sense, right? How much I'm going to trust at that time Oregon's corners to just go one on one all the time might be something we'll have to wait and see. But on the surface right now, I think Dante Manning could be poised for elite forward this year. I've talked about that here on the show, and I think Christian Gonzalez is going to be really, really solid. And that's one of the interesting matchups to watch that I'll get to here in a moment. But if Oregon wins this game, I think it comes from setting the tone early, staying aggressive, forcing an early turnover, building a lead, and then not sitting on it, right? Getting a lead and then playing to win by even more rather than what I think Cristobal and his staff were susceptible to, getting a lead and then playing not to lose and just trying to, run out the clock essentially starting in the third quarter. Then you let the team back into it. And we know how that script tended to go. If Washington State were to pull this upset, what might that look like? I think the number one way that would play out is if the Cougars defense is able to wreak some havoc. And you don't think of Washington State as a defensive school. You think of Mike Leach, you think of the air raid and the points they've been scoring. They still have an air raid philosophy, though it's got a little bit of a wrinkle now. Kind of what they've been running is an air raid, but with a little bit more action where the running backs and tight ends are involved. The running backs in the running game, actually, in addition to the passing game, and actually using some tight ends. But they're still going to be very pass heavy. That's why you bring in a guy like Cam Ward that's playing to his strengths. Is if you go out there and throw the ball 40 to 50 times, he's a guy who is capable of doing that and racking up some points. But if Washington State wins this game, I think their offense has to be sufficient. Their offensive line is not going to be a strength as much as it was in past years because they've lost a couple of their starters up front. But I don't know if Oregon has the defensive line to exploit that. But I think the biggest thing that you'd see if the Cougars are going to pull this upset against the Ducks here to begin conference play, I think two names that we're going to be tired of hearing by the end of the night are Ron Stone Jr. and Brennan Jackson. And Stone is a preseason first team All Pac-12 performer. And you don't think about that with Washington State, right? You think if they have someone on a preseason first team All Pac-12 list, as they do this year, as nominated by the Pac-12 media members, it's going to be someone on the offensive side, probably a wide receiver or and maybe an offensive lineman in there. But they've got a defensive guy in there, and Stone is a stud. And I think if he and Jackson are able to generate havoc and just speed up Bo Nix and cause some chaos there, you could force him into some turnovers, and that could be the sort of momentum shifting play that Washington State needs to either get back in the game or maybe to build on a lead, depending on how things play out. But the reason that it still doesn't give me a ton of pause is I trust our offensive line implicitly. Even without Cristobal and Mirabal there, the guys that they that they coached are still in place, and it's basically the same offensive line, and they were really, really good. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier when talking about, Oregon was better than Washington State last year. The offensive line was dominant. Anthony Brown was running wild. Cardwell sealed the game with a late touchdown. Travis Dye ran the ball well aside from the fumble, but there were lanes to be had. There was a lot of Anthony Brown running in that game, but the lanes were there because the offensive line was just absolutely crushing them up front. Now, the reason that it's slightly different than last year is I expect us to pass the ball at least a little bit more. And so that matchup that I just alluded to, the offensive line against Ron Stone Jr. and Brennan Jackson, is pertaining to pass protection, right? Is Anthony Brown was not pressured immensely last year, but they also didn't throw the ball that often because they didn't need to. They were running so effectively and getting just 6-7 yards per carry, and we know that that's what Mario absolutely loved to do, and so that's what they did, and ultimately we're able to get the win. But also, we're not trying to utilize play action in a significant way to take some shots down the field. It was just small chunk here, smaller chunk here, big-ish chunk there, but small chunk here, and it was running the ball effectively. But if you go back and watch the highlights of that game, the offensive line is moving guys around. So I think that's the way that Washington State is able to win this game. I don't think they are going to be able to outscore Oregon because the defense I expect to be much improved from what they were a season ago. And Oregon's got better offensive skill talent anyway across the board, especially on the offensive line. And so I think it's got to be the Washington State defense. And Dickert comes from the defensive side of the ball. He was their defensive coordinator before he was named their full time head coach after Rolovich was sent away. And I think that those two guys who are the headliners on the defensive side of the ball for the Cougars this year have to be able to wreak havoc on Bo Nix and force him into a bad turnover or two. But if I had to guess, I'd say the offensive line is going to be up to the task. Give him some clean pockets and let him, try and slice and dice the defense a little bit and hopefully make some plays. Let's move to key matchups and position groups to watch in this matchup. And I think that I think there is one commonality or kind of holdover from the Mike Leach era that's still there at Washington State, and that's the number one thing you have to stop is the relationship between the quarterback and the wide receivers. That's where this offense is going to try to operate at a high level. And so I think there are two position group matchups to watch here. First are and foremost, and this is definitely first and foremost for Oregon, are defensive backs against their wide receivers. They don't have as much talent as they used to. They lost one of their top guys, but Washington State still has Renard Bell. And an individual matchup to look for here is Christian Gonzalez, because I think he's going to be Oregon's top corner this year. But guys who are a team's number one corner, they all have different mindsets and approaches to how they play the game. Excuse me. Some guys are okay with following a guy around and playing both sides of the field. But some guys, I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan, so I of course have this reference. He's also a former Pac-12 player. Richard Sherman only liked to play on the left side, right? That's what he did, and he would just kind of take away that side of the field. But he didn't follow a receiver to the other side. But part of that was also that Pete Carroll's defensive philosophy involves heavy zone coverage, and so moving Richard around didn't make it wasn't as needed. But he could have done it, but he chose not to. He liked to play on that side of the field. I haven't studied Gonzo enough to know whether or not he'd be willing to do this. But the top receiver for Washington State this year, again, is probably going to be Renard Bell, who is a name Oregon fans I'm sure recognize from past meetings with the Cougars because he is a really really talented player, and there's no doubt that Cam Ward is going to come out and he's going to throw the ball early and often, and they're going to keep doing it throughout the course of the game. And Reynard Bell figures to be one of the top targets there. They might even have to lean on him more than usual because their running back situation's a little questionable. Max Borghi is not there. Some of you might be wondering about that. Max Borghi is gone. He's off to the NFL. And as Oregon fans, I think we should say thank goodness because that guy was really effective and he converted a couple third and longs last year. You run it when you're certainly expecting them to throw it, and he was really good catching passes out of the backfield too. They don't have Deion McIntosh either, so there's some turnover there at the running back position, and I think that's going to cause them to lean a little bit more heavily, even than normal, on their passing game, but maybe their defense as well. The other key matchup and position group to watch for is I kind of mentioned this earlier, our offensive line and their defensive line, and whether or not their defense is going to be able to get off the field on third down. Because if Oregon is able to get themselves into advantageous third downs, the way that they were able to dominate the run blocking last year, we should just run it. And I know I might sound a little bit like Mario here, though I'll touch on that in just a sec. If it's 3rd and 3, Oregon should be running the ball almost every time because last year Washington State had no answer for it. The place I want to see Oregon adjust their play calling from a season ago to get more aggressive is when you have a 9-yard play on first down, do not run the ball on 2nd and 1. Take a shot. Try to dial something up for Seven McGee or Dante Thornton or Chris Hudson or Troy Franklin over the top. Somebody. Chase Cota, Caleb Chapman, I don't know. Somebody, right? There's a bunch of weapons out there. Maybe one of the tight ends. But in thinking back and watching some of the highlights from Oregon's wins last year, Second and two, second and three was never a shot play. It should be, right? Philosophically, you have third down, especially if you're on the opponent's side of the field. You could be in four down territory. That's a place where I think you need to be taking your shots down the field. But Mario wanted to run the ball, as we know, and Oregon did it very effectively, of course. But if you have that card in your back pocket, so to speak, of look, it's third down and two, or it's second down and two, and I know that on third and two, I can just call a running play, and our offensive line is going to be better than yours. I think that'll allow Kenny Dillingham to give Bo Nix some opportunities to try to take some shots down the field, get some cheap touchdowns that were just lacking from Oregon's offense last year, really up until the Alamo Bowl second half against Oklahoma. So that's why I think if Washington State's defensive line is not able to, one consider generate consistent pressure on Bo Nix or stop the run, Oregon could really have a pretty easy time here because I think the offense, at least in theory, should be more open than it was a season ago. But if those two position group battles are won by Oregon, I think this could actually be a really big win because, I led the show saying this. I think Oregon was even better than they showed against Washington State a season ago. I think that game should have been like 42-14 or 42-21, and instead it was 38-24, and it was a 24-17 game with just inside of 6 minutes to go. So it really got close and competitive, and then the offensive line took over, and we just kind of ran it down their throats. That's great. But rather than that being a feature of the offense, I would like that to be sort of a fallback option for how Oregon can pick up first downs at crucial times and move the chains and keep that Cougar defense on the field. I think Oregon will be able to win this game. I feel pretty good about it. Like you look at it on paper right now, and you say, man, that seems like a trap game, and it could be, right? There's no doubt about it. We lost four straight against the Cougs from 2015 to 2018, including two meetings in Pullman, and Oregon was favored, I think, in both of those games. 2016, well, everything went wrong in 2016, but 2018 with Justin Herbert, Washington State was 25th. We were 12th, coming off that Husky win at home with C.J. Verdell in overtime. Went up there and laid an egg, but I'm hoping that this coaching staff is going to be able to be an upgrade in that sense schematically on Saturdays to the point where you beat a team that like Washington State that's good that can give you a fight, but you're better than ultimately. And I think that if Oregon get off to a strong start and keep their foot on the gas pedal here, I don't think Washington has got the horses to keep up with them. I think just closing here with a couple of key stats that I'll keep looking at here as we go through these game previews. I think Oregon keeping Washington State from getting over 300 passing yards, I think that's a win. I think that's your kind of lock stat or whatever you want to call it. If Oregon it keeps them keeps Cam Ward under 300 yards. If you tell me before the game he only goes for 270, I don't think Washington State will be able to run the ball effectively enough against a defense that has got Dorless and Popo in the middle with Sam Taimani and Justin Flo and Noah Sewell. I don't think the Cougars, who lost starters from their offensive line, will be able to run the ball enough to keep up with what Oregon's offense, at the very least, is capable of being. So if they can limit the air raid attack a little bit more, then I think this will be a game that Oregon can come out on top of. But I think the Cougars are also a team that I really like in the Pac-12 North this year. I talk about this a lot on my Locked On Pac-12 show. I really do think that Washington State will be a team that's over 500 again. I've got them going 7-5, but I think ultimately they drop this one to the Ducks. But those are kind of the areas that they have to watch out for. And if Oregon can win those key position group battles, offensive line, DBs against the wide receivers, then I think they will be just fine. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.